The sharp gravel sliced into my bare heels, but I could not feel the pain over the roar of the American Shermans. My unit was gone, dissolved like ash into the German pines. It was April 1945. I stood in the freezing mud of the Ruhr pocket, a starving ghost waiting for the end of the world to finally arrive. The vibration of the Sherman tanks didn't just reach my ears. It crawled up through the soles of my bare feet, shaking the very marrow of my bones. I shifted my weight, and a fresh jolt of agony flared from the raw, sliced skin of my heels where the Ruhr gravel had embedded itself like shrapnel in my numb flesh. My left eye socket, that hollow cavern of scar tissue where a shard of Russian steel had visited me months prior, pulsed with the damp, invasive chill of the German spring. I gripped the hem of my Volkssturm tunic, the wool so heavy with rainwater and filth that it pulled at my narrow shoulders, threatening to drag my emaciated frame down into the churning muck. It was a garment meant for a man, a soldier with meat on his bones, not a boy whose ribs stood out like the rafters of a burned-out barn. Somewhere to my right, a pine limb snapped under the weight of an advancing hull, a sound like a pistol shot that made my heart hammer against my brittle chest wall. I was 17, but in that moment, staring into the gray, smoke-choked veil of the woods, I felt like an ancient, discarded thing, a relic of a 1,000-year dream that had lasted only 12 nightmare years. The hunger was no longer a mere craving. It was a physical weight, a dull, throbbing ache that made my vision swim and my hands tremble with a rhythmic, unstoppable palsy. I hadn't eaten anything but a handful of blackened dandelion roots and a paste made of sawdust in 3 days, and my mouth was a desert of dry, metallic-tasting saliva. Then the metal beast emerged from the pines, a slab of olive-drab steel, dripping with forest sludge, its long cannon sniffing the air like a predator seeking the scent of the dying. I didn't move. I couldn't have moved if the Fuhrer himself had risen from the bunker to command me to stand at attention.
Hold your fire. Hold it. He's just a kid, for God's sake. Look at him.
The voice was strange, a melodic, nasal cadence I didn't recognize, stripped of the guttural barks and sharp, jagged edges of the German Unteroffiziers who had vanished into the tree line an hour before. I looked up, my one good eye squinting against the glare of the overcast sky, and saw a man in a clean, high-collared jacket stepping through the haze of diesel exhaust.
Hey there, son. Put him up. Drop whatever you've got in your hands. Slow now.
I had nothing in my hands but the memory of a rifle I had dropped in a drainage ditch. 2 miles back, but I raised my arms anyway, the frayed sleeves of the oversized tunic sliding down to reveal wrists as thin and white as dry kindling. My breath hitched in a throat constricted by terror and the sudden overwhelming scent of something impossible. The rich, sweet aroma of chocolate and the sharp, clean tang of Virginia tobacco. The American captain walked toward me, his boots real leather, sturdy, polished, despite the mud, and impossibly whole, crunching rhythmically on the debris of my shattered homeland.
Easy, easy. You look like a stiff breeze would blow you straight to Berlin, soldier.
I wanted to tell him I wasn't a soldier, that I was just Friedrich, a boy who liked the smell of yeast and warm flour, but the words died in my parched, cracked throat. He stopped 5 feet from me, and for the first time I saw his face. Not the face of the Bolshevik monsters the radio had promised, but a man with tired human eyes and a jaw darkened by a day's worth of healthy, well-fed stubble.
Jesus, kid. When was the last time you saw a square meal? You're nothing but skin and a uniform.
I let out a jagged breath, my knees buckling slightly as the adrenaline began to drain away, leaving only the cold and the crushing reality of my own frailty. All I could look at was the pocket of his jacket, where a silver foil wrapper caught the dim light, reflecting a world of abundance. I could no longer comprehend. My stomach let out a low guttural growl that sounded like a dying animal, a sound so loud it seemed to echo off the steel flanks of the tanks idling behind him. The captain reached into that pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a wounded animal that might bite out of sheer panicked instinct.
I'm reaching for some candy, okay? Just candy. Don't go dying on me yet. I slowly peeled back the silver paper, the crinkle of the foil sounding like a brush fire in the unnatural silence of the clearing. The scent of the chocolate hit the air, a heavy, rich sweetness that felt thick enough to chew. It was a smell from another lifetime, one that didn't belong in this landscape of charred timber and gray slush. I broke off a square with a sharp, clean snap and held it out toward the boy, my leather glove stained with the oil of a dozen tank repairs.
The aroma of the cocoa reached me before his hand did, and my mouth flooded with a sudden painful rush of saliva. I hadn't eaten anything but a handful of dried beet pulp in 3 days, and my stomach cramped so violently I had to double over, clutching my midsection with my claw-like hands. I stared at the dark brown square resting in his palm. It was perfect. It wasn't the gritty, sawdust-filled rationers we had been given at the front. It was smooth, oily, and smelled of a wealth I couldn't comprehend. I looked at his glove, the sturdy hide of it uncracked, and then at my own fingers, which were blue-gray and tipped with broken, blackened nails.
I watched him hesitate, his one good eye darting from the chocolate to my face, and back again, like a bird waiting for a trap to spring. He looked less like a soldier and more like a pile of laundry someone had discarded in the mud. The field gray tunic he wore was so large the shoulder seams hung halfway down his biceps, and the empty socket of his left eye was a raw red crater that made my own chest tighten. I nudged my hand forward an inch. Eat. It's okay. We've got crates of the stuff back at the railhead.
I reached out, my arm trembling so hard that my sleeve rattled against my skin. When my fingers brushed his glove, the leather felt warm, radiating a heat that my own body had long ago surrendered. I took the chocolate. The weight of it was nothing, yet it felt like holding a bar of solid gold. I didn't chew it. I couldn't. I placed it on my tongue and let it sit there. The sugar was an explosion, a violent assault of pleasure that made my head swim. I closed my eye, and for a second, the sound of the idling Sherman tanks faded into a low hum, replaced by the ghost memory of my mother's kitchen before the windows had been blown out.
The kid's face transformed as the sugar hit his system. The tension in his jaw slackened, and for a fleeting moment the haunting, hollow look in his eyes softened. I stood up slowly, keeping my hands visible, and signaled to the sergeant by the lead tank to hold his position. I looked down at the boy, who was now licking a smear of chocolate off his thumb with a desperation that turned my stomach. We're going to move now, Friedrich. There's a truck coming up the road. It's going to take you to a collection point near the coast.
The mention of the coast sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the biting wind. The coast meant the water meant the end of the world. I swallowed the last of the sweetness, the back of my throat burning with the richness of it. I looked up at the captain, squinting against the dull gray sky. His uniform was clean, his boots were intact, and he spoke of crates of chocolate as if they were common stones. He reached out a hand to help me up, and I realized with a sickening jolt.
I gripped his elbow to hoist him up, and it felt like grabbing a bundle of dry kindling. There was no muscle there, just bone, and the friction of the coarse wool tunic. He stood on shaky legs, the oversized boots he'd scavenged from a dead man nearly tripping him, as he tried to find his balance. I kept my hand on his shoulder, steadying him. Keep that wrapper in your pocket, son. Might be a bit of dust left in the corners later.
I tucked the silver foil into my pocket, my fingers trembling as they touched the metal cool surface. I looked toward the west, where the sky was a bruised purple. Somewhere beyond the smoke of the burning village lay the sea, a vast cold mouth waiting to swallow me. I didn't know then that the chocolate was merely the first sign of the impossible. I only knew that the man holding my arm had enough food in his pockets to buy my life 10 times over. And for the first time since the recruitment officers had knocked on our door, I felt the cold knot of terror in my chest begin to melt into a dull, aching confusion. The truck lurched to a final bone-jarring halt, the metal bed vibrating against my thin shoulder blades through the threadbare wool of my tunic. I squinted my remaining eye as the canvas flap at the rear was thrown back, admitting a flood of light so fierce and unyielding it felt like a physical blow against my face. The air that rushed into the transport was thick and heavy, smelling of resinous pine needles, wet red clay, and the sharp, oily sting of diesel exhaust that hung in the humid Georgian night.
Watch your step, son. The transition from the dark can be tricky on the equilibrium when you've been in the hold of a ship for 2 weeks.
I reached out, my fingers trembling as they gripped the rough, splintered wood of the tailgate, feeling the incredible oppressive heat of the American South pressing against my skin like a warm, wet wool blanket. My boots, caked with the gray, pulverized dust of a dying continent, struck the Georgia gravel with a crunch that sounded far too loud in the sudden rhythmic stillness of this strange new world.
Keep moving toward the building with the white trim. We need to get you processed and out of those rags before the colonel does his rounds.
I looked up at the long, low-slung wooden barracks, their windows glowing with a steady, buzzing luminescence that I had not seen in years, not since the blackouts turned the world into a series of jagged shadows and fearful silhouettes. The interior of the intake facility was a revelation of stark, impossible whiteness. The walls painted a color so clean and reflective it made my vision swim and my empty socket ache with a phantom pressure. Above me, long glass tubes hummed with a low-frequency vibration I could feel in my teeth, casting a cold, artificial glare that revealed every speck of dirt on my cracked fingernails and every frayed thread on my oversized field gray sleeves.
Stand behind the yellow line painted on the floor and wait for the sergeant to call your name. Don't wander off or the MPs will have a reason to get bored.
I stood there, my emaciated frame swaying slightly, feeling like a specimen pinned to a corkboard under a microscope in a laboratory built for the clinical study of broken things. The smell of floor wax, harsh, citrusy, and aggressively synthetic, competed with the aroma of roasting meat drifting from somewhere deep within the camp, a scent so rich and fatty it made the empty pit of my stomach ache. I glanced at my reflection in a polished window pane and saw a ghost staring back, a skeletal boy with a hollowed-out socket where a soul should be, draped in the oversized, tattered remnants of a lost and forgotten cause.
Don't look so worried, Weber. The war is over for you, and we have more than enough soap, hot water, and fresh cotton to go around for everyone in this line.
I watched the captain's hands as he adjusted his cap, noticing for the first time the way the fabric of his uniform was crisp, thick, and utterly devoid of the desperate patches or crude repairs that defined every garment I had seen since 1943. This was the true, terrifying face of the enemy, a world where light was cheap, where cloth was abundant, and where the very air tasted of machines that never stopped running because they never ran out of fuel. I felt the floor beneath my feet, solid, level, and scrubbed with a ferocity that suggested no shortage of cleaning supplies, and realized that for the first time in my life I was in a place that didn't smell of wood smoke, cordite, or rot.
Follow the man in the white apron toward the rear of the hall. He'll show you to the showers in the delousing station.
I moved forward, the hum of the fluorescent lights vibrating in the marrow of my bones, my mind struggling to process the sheer terrifying brilliance of a nation that could afford to keep the darkness at bay with the simple flick of a brass switch. Every step across the gleaming linoleum floor felt like a betrayal of the mud I had left behind, a slow, methodical transition from the grit of the trenches to the clinical impossible precision of this Georgia laboratory. I halted before a heavy wooden desk that smelled of lemon wax and old paper, my boots clicking with a hollow, pathetic sound against the floor. I felt the weight of my oversized tunic pulling at my shoulders, the coarse wool chafing against my collarbone, where the meat had long since withered away.
He did not look up immediately, his fountain pen scratching across a ledger with a rhythmic, confident hiss that spoke of a world where paper was not a luxury, and ink did not have to be rationed like blood.
I stared at the top of his head, noting the silver-gray hair cropped with such precision it looked like a velvet cap. It was a stark contrast to the jagged, lice-bitten hacks the company barber had given us back in the Rhineland, back when we still pretended we were an army. The American's uniform was a deep, rich olive, the fabric so thick and unblemished it seemed impossible that he lived on the same planet where I had spent 3 months huddled in a crater, filled with freezing gray meltwater.
He finally set the pen down in a groove on the desk and looked up, his eyes a steady, piercing blue that didn't hold the jagged edge of cruelty I had come to expect from men in positions of power. "Son," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet room. "You look like you've walked all the way from Berlin on those sticks you call legs."
I didn't understand the words, only the cadence. It was a soft sound, devoid of the barked consonants of my commanders. I stood as straight as my spine would allow, my right eye fixed on a point just above his head, while the empty, clean socket on my left felt like a cold thumb pressing into my skull. I waited for the blow, or the shout, or the command to strip. That was the ritual of the captive.
He stood up, and the sheer scale of him was a physical weight. He was tall, well-fed, and moved with a casual grace that only comes from a lifetime of never wondering where his next meal would come from. He rounded the desk, his polished brown shoes mirroring the overhead lights, and stopped just a few inches from me.
I flinched as he reached out, my breath hitching in a chest that felt as brittle as dry kindling. I expected his hands to be rough, to grab my jaw and twist my head, so he could inspect the ruin of my face like a farmer checking a dying horse. Instead, his fingers hovered near my temple, hesitant, almost reverent.
He leaned in closer, his brow furrowing as he inspected the edges of the empty socket. He wasn't looking for a reason to discard me. He was looking at the wound with the clinical, focused pity of a man who had the resources to heal it.
That was when it hit me. As he moved closer, a scent enveloped me, washing over the lingering stench of diesel, wet wool, and the metallic tang of old fear that clung to my skin. It wasn't the smell of a soldier. There was no tobacco breath, no sour sweat, no grease. It was the sharp, cool, and impossibly sweet scent of peppermint soap.
He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small white handkerchief, using a corner of it to gently dab a bead of moisture from the edge of my scarred orbit.
The peppermint was overwhelming. It was the smell of a Christmas I barely remembered, a scent of candy and comfort that had no place in a theater of war. My mind recoiled. Our leaders had told us the Americans were a decadent, crumbling race, a soft people who would break under the iron will of the Reich. But as the sweetness of that soap filled my lungs, I realized the terrifying truth. A nation that could afford to make its soldiers smell like peppermint, a nation that could waste such luxury on the mere act of washing, was a nation that could never be beaten. We had been fighting a war against a mountain of sugar and steel, and we had been told we were winning right up until the moment the mountain fell on us. I looked at the captain, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of what he would do to me. I was terrified by the realization that he could afford to be kind. The office was small, but it felt vast compared to the cattle cars and the holds of the transport ships, and the hum of a small electric fan on the corner of the desk was a sound of such mechanical luxury that it made my ears ring.
He sat behind the heavy oak desk, his uniform pressed so sharply that the creases looked like they could draw blood, and he didn't look at the files in front of him. He looked directly into my face.
I could smell the peppermint soap still clinging to my skin, a scent that felt like a mask I wasn't worthy to wear. And I felt the weight of my oversized Volkssturm tunic, the wool scratchy and smelling of old rain, and the stale sweat of the dead man who had owned it before me.
He reached into a drawer and pulled out a silver tin, sliding it across the polished wood with a casual grace that spoke of a man who had never known the gnawing, hollow ache of a stomach turned inward on itself.
My one good eye followed the movement of the tin, watching the way the sunlight from the Georgia morning caught the metal, and I felt the draft from the fan hit the empty, clean socket on the left side of my face.
"The doctor who processed you this morning was confused, Friedrich," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone that lacked the jagged edge of the officers I had known in the East.
I looked at the interpreter standing in the shadows, a silent ghost who translated the captain's words into my own tongue, but I kept my gaze fixed on the captain's eyes, which were the color of a clear Atlantic sky.
He tapped a pencil against the desk, the sound rhythmic and peaceful like a heartbeat that wasn't afraid of stopping. He said the wound is too clean for shrapnel, too precise for a bayonet. He said it looks like someone took it from you with a scalpel.
I felt a phantom itch behind the bridge of my nose, a memory of the cold, sterile steel that had once touched me in a place where no light reaches, and I gripped the hem of my frayed sleeves until my knuckles turned the color of bone.
"Who did this to you?" he asked. And for a moment, the abundance of the room, the coffee steaming in a ceramic mug, the bowl of white sugar, the stack of clean paper, seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of us in the silence.
"It was not a wound of war, Herr Capitan," I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle, like dry leaves skittering across a paved road. "It was a payment."
He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking, a rich, deep sound of expensive things, and he gestured for me to continue, his expression unreadable, but devoid of the cruelty I had been trained to expect.
I told him about the work camp outside of Weimar, about the mud that swallowed boots and the Scharführer who found sport in the terror of children, specifically a boy named Lukas who had dropped a crate of rifle stocks.
The captain didn't blink. He just watched me, the smoke from his cigarette curling toward the ceiling in a lazy, unhurried spiral that made me think of the chimneys in the distance back home, though his smoke smelled of toasted tobacco instead of bitter ash.
I explained how the guard had drawn his Luger, the black metal gleaming with oil, and how I had stepped between the barrel and the boy's shaking chest, offering the only thing I had left that possessed any value in a world of shadows.
He shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to reconcile the emaciated boy in front of him with the story of a surgical sacrifice.
"There was a doctor among the prisoners," I whispered, the words tasting like iron in my mouth. "A man who had once been a surgeon in Berlin. He had hidden a kit, a single scalpel and a bottle of high-proof alcohol, and the guard agreed to the trade, my eye for the boy's life, provided it was done while the guard watched, to ensure I felt the cost."
He looked down at his own hands, clean and steady, and I saw a flicker of something in his gaze, not pity, but a profound, staggering bewilderment that a world could exist where such a bargain was struck.
I told him how the doctor's hands hadn't shaken, how the blade had been a cold mercy compared to the guard's laughter, and how the taking had been so clean because the doctor wanted to ensure I would survive to see the end of the madness with the one eye I had left.
He reached out and pushed the bowl of white sugar toward me, a gesture so simple and yet so devastating in its casual wealth that I felt the first tear prick the corner of my remaining eye.
As I looked at the mountain of sugar, gleaming like fallen snow in the Georgia sun, I realized that the man sitting across from me didn't need to be cruel to win. He belonged to a world that could afford the luxury of a conscience.
He stood up from his stool, the heavy soles of his polished brown boots thudding softly on the wooden floor as he turned toward a white-enameled cabinet.
I watched the broad expanse of his back, the olive-drab fabric of his shirt stretched tight across his shoulders, and I waited for the sound of a key turning in a lock or the sharp metallic click of a drawer being opened to reveal a tool of pain.
He reached for a roll of sterilized gauze and a small amber glass jar, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were trying not to startle a wounded animal hiding in the brush.
The air in the small room was thick with the scent of pine oil and the sharp, biting tang of rubbing alcohol, a smell that reminded me of the field hospitals behind the odor, though here it lacked the underlying stench of gangrene and unwashed bodies.
He unscrewed the lid of the jar, and a faint, minty aroma of wintergreen drifted toward me as he dipped a clean wooden spatula into a pale, translucent ointment.
I flinched when he stepped back into my personal space, my muscles locking tight against the tattered lining of my oversized tunic, my one good eye tracking the movement of his hand as if it were a bayonet.
"Steady, son," he murmured, his voice a low, rhythmic hum that carried no edge of command, only a strange, weary patience that I didn't know how to process.
He reached out and gently tilted my chin upward with the pads of his fingers. His skin was warm and calloused, smelling faintly of soap and the tobacco he had handled earlier, and for a second I forgot to breathe.
He began to apply the cool ointment around the edges of my empty left eye socket, his touch so light it felt like the ghost of a breeze, carefully soothing the angry red skin where the dirt of the march had chafed me, raw.
The coolness of the salve was an unexpected mercy, a quiet dampening of the fire that had burned in my face for weeks, and I felt the tension in my jaw begin to crumble despite my efforts to remain a soldier.
He set the spatula down on the metal tray with a soft clink and began to unroll the gauze, the fabric a dazzling, impossible white that seemed to hum with the same clean energy as the sugar bowl.
I looked at the gauze and thought of the gray, stiffened rags we had used to bind wounds in the ruins of Berlin, bandages that were washed and reused until they were more bacteria than cloth.
He looped the white ribbon around my head, his hands moving with a practiced rhythmic grace, tucking the end securely into the fold without ever once pulling too tight or causing me to wince.
The world became half shadow as the clean fabric covered the hollow side of my face, and the weight of the bandage felt like a hand resting on my shoulder, telling me that I no longer had to look at the wreckage of myself in the mirror.
He stepped back to inspect his work, then reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular object wrapped in a crinkling layer of silver foil and brown paper.
My heart gave a sudden, painful thump against my ribs as he tore the corner of the wrapper, the sound sharp and electric in the quiet room, followed immediately by the rich, heavy scent of toasted cocoa and milk.
He broke off a thick square of the dark chocolate and held it out to me, the edges of the bar straight and sharp, a tiny monument of luxury held between his thumb and forefinger.
I reached out, my fingers trembling so violently that they brushed against his palm, and I took the morsel as if it were a holy relic, feeling the weight of it, the solid, oily richness that promised a world without hunger.
He didn't say a word as I put the chocolate in my mouth. He simply watched me, his blue eyes softening behind his spectacles as he leaned back against the edge of the desk.
The sweetness exploded against my tongue, a physical shock that made my vision blur, melting into a velvet warmth that slid down my throat and seemed to settle the very core of my shaking frame.
He reached out and patted my arm once, a quick, solid gesture of recognition, before he began to gather his instruments to leave.
I sat there on the stool, the taste of chocolate still coating my teeth and the clean bandage tight around my brow, and I realized that the war had finally stopped chasing me. I was no longer a resource to be used, but a soul that someone could afford to be kind. I look at my hands now, veined like dry leaves, spotted with the slow ink of age, and I can still feel the ghost of that American chocolate melting against my palate. For years I had been a cog in a machine that measured a man only by his ability to hold a rifle or shovel dirt. But in that room in Georgia, Captain Harmon saw a boy who had been hollowed out. He didn't see a prisoner of war, he saw a person worth the cost of a clean bandage and a moment of rest. It is a strange thing to realize after a lifetime of looking back, that the greatest victory I ever witnessed wasn't won with artillery, but with a piece of candy and a refusal to be cruel. The characters, incidents, and dialogue in this video are dramatized for narrative and entertainment effect. While some events may be inspired by real-life themes, this story is a work of fiction.